when we look at a plant, the most beautiful part that comes to our vision is a flower. What exactly is a flower? Let's say, for example, the leaves of the plant, they perform the task of photosynthesis, the stem for conduction, the roots for absorption of the water and nutrients. So the flower of a plant, it performs the task of reproduction. So we can say that a flower is a reproductive part of a plant. Okay, so if we look at a flower, let's say we have a typical flower. Now if we observe very carefully, we can see that it's very much similar to a stem. So what we have is, we have got a stem. Okay, the stem characteristic features is that it has got a nodes and internodes. At each nodes we have got the leaves that comes out in different formations. Now if we compress the stem in such a way that the nodes and internodes are not distinct, in that case what can happen, it will seem like the leaves are directly overlapping with each other in different formations. Okay, so generally the leaves are green, but if these leaves are colorful, in that case it will take the form of a flower. Okay, so from here what we can say, a flower is a modified stem that is designed for reproduction. Okay, now if we look at the flower, we can see that it is born on a stalk. This stalk on which a flower is born, we call it as pedicel. There are so many things that is observable in a flower. We can see that it contains a base. Okay, so the base are generally a bit enlarged so that it can support the other floral parts. So it is known as receptacle, or also known as thalamus. So this receptacle or the thalamus is a structure which will support the rest of the other floral parts. Now let's look into a typical flower. Here we have a typical flower. So this is our pedicel. Okay, and this is our thalamus or the receptacle that we have. In any typical flower, okay, in any typical flower we can see that we have got a four whorl. Okay, so these four whorls are nothing but the concentric rings. So let's say, for example, right at the center we have got the receptacle or the thalamus, and the one which is there on the outside, okay, the outermost is comparable with the calyx. Okay, so what we see is, this is the outermost and this is calyx for us. So this calyx, the individual unit of the calyx is known as the sepal. Okay, so this is the outermost and it is known as calyx. What we understand is the calyx, it is generally green in color. Okay, so if we take a flower that is a rose, what we can see over here, this is the colorful part. Okay, this color part is the petal, and the one that we see here in green, this is our calyx. Okay, now this inner to the calyx, okay, the one that I just said that as petal, collectively they are known as corolla, okay, and its singular form is known as petal. Now the third inner wall is known as androsium. Individual unit of the androsium is known as stamen. Okay, so what we see is, this is in blue, the one that we can see over here. Okay, the one in blue, this is the androsium for us. Now here the androsium contains two basic parts, that is the anther and the filament. Okay, together they make the stamen, and lots of stamens, collectively they are known as the androsium. So this androsium is the male reproductive part. Now just like in human we have got the testis in male, so the anther can be synonymous with the testis. So what does the testis does is, it is the organ or the site where the male gametes, that is the sperms, are formed. Exactly like that, the androsium, the anther is like the testis where the male gametes, that is the pollen grain for the plants, will be formed. Okay, so the male gametes would be formed over here. Now if we look at the innermost wall, the innermost wall is the gynosium. The innermost wall is the gynosium. Individual unit of gynosium is known as carpel. Okay, so what we had was, we had the calyx in the outermost wall, we have got the corolla, we have got the androsium, and then we have got the gynosium. Okay, this is the innermost wall, and this is the female reproductive part of the plant. Okay, now if we magnify this, okay, if we magnify a gynosium, we can see that it bears as three distinct regions. Okay, so let's say for example this is a region which is broad and flat at the tip, so we call that region as stigma, and the one which is long and slender, that is style. Okay, so this is long and slender. Slender in other word would mean thin. Okay, so it's very thin and long. And the one which is swollen, okay, so that would be our ovary. Okay, inside the ovary, the ovule will be there. Our ovule will be there inside the ovary. So let's say this is the ovule. Inside the ovary, the ovule will be there. So this ovary in future, it will become the fruit, and the ovule in future, after fertilization, it will become the seed. Okay, so if we look more into the structure of ovule, or if we focus on the ovary, we can see some more detailed features. Let's look into that. So if we focus on the ovary, okay, what we can see is that we have got a structure which we call it as ovule. Okay, if we focus on the details of the ovule, we can see that it bears certain layers of the skin. That layers of the skin, we would call it as integuments. Okay, so integument in the future, it would become the skin of the seed. Okay, and then generally 2 or 3 layers of integuments are there in a typical ovule. Now this integument, it is not complete in a particular site or a region. So that particular site where the integument is not complete, that is known as micropyle. So we can say that in a way micropyle is like the pore. Okay, so this pore in future would help in the entry of the pollen tube. It would also in future be responsible for the exchange of gases from that particular site. Okay, and we can also see that we have a stalk on which the ovule is present. That stalk we call it as funicle. Funicle, in the later part, it would become the placenta. Okay, and the site that is just opposite to the micropyle, this region, we call it as the chalaza. And inside the ovule we have got a sac, a pouch or a bag we can say, so where the embryonic development will occur. That sac we call it as embryo sac. Sac means the bag, okay, where the embryonic development will occur. Okay, this is the site where the male gametes, female gametes are also present, and this is the site where the fertilization will occur. So in our exam, especially in our medical entrance exams, they would possibly ask us, where does the fertilization occurs? So our answer should be the fertilization occurs inside the embryo sac. Okay, now if we look at this female reproductive part, if we look at the stigma, we can see that it is broad and flat. Okay, so our stigma is broad and flat. Now what advantage can it have if it is broad and flat? If it is broad and flat, its surface area will increase. Okay, its surface area will increase. If its surface area increases, then it can catch or hold more and more pollen grains, so that it can ensure that it receives the best of the pollen grains, which will compete with each other, so that the next generations could have superior qualities. Now the style is thin and long. What advantage can it have if it is thin and long? If it is thin and long, then what will happen is the pollen tubes, each of the pollen grains will germinate to form the pollen tube. So this pollen tubes, what will they do? They will try to compete with each other. It's a kind of race where they are competing with each other. So if it is long, then it will give the best of the pollen grain enough of the opportunity to move ahead of others, so that way it will get the best possible chance to fertilize the egg which is there inside the embryo egg. You should know that this pollen tube must have to travel all the way to the micropyle in general, and it should penetrate the embryo sac, and then only it would be able to fertilize. So we can say that if the style is thin and long, then the best of the pollen tube would only be able to fertilize. So in a way, this structure creates a evolutionary advantage to the plants. Now if we look into the male reproductive part, okay, if we look into the male reproductive part, the individual unit, we call it as stamen, and just like we have told a bit earlier, this stalk on which the anther is born, we call it as filament. The filament is mainly responsible for conduction. It will bring the nutrients for the development of the pollen grains in the anther. So since it is responsible for conduction, it would have the connective tissues. By connective tissues like your xylem and phloem. Now if we make a section of the anther and magnify it, what we can see is that the anther, it contains four lobes. Okay, it contains the four lobes. Each of the lobe will have the pollen sac. So the one that we see right at the center, that is our pollen sac. So since we have got the four lobes, we have four pollen sacs. The sac means, let's say if we say that this is the pollen sac in yellow, so this is our pollen sac. Now the sac means, like I told you earlier, this is nothing but a pouch or a bag. So this bag, it is like this. Now inside the bag we have got lots and lots of pollen grains. There are lots of pollen grains out there inside the bag. Okay, so this inside the pollen sac, the pollen grain development occurs, and once when the pollen grain matures, we'll have lots of pollen grains that would be available inside the pollen sac. And finally, when all the floral parts are fully matured and the pollen grains are ready, this pollen sac or the anther will burst and the pollen grains will come out. Okay, so the pollen grain, what we know is this is a male gamete. In the other future lectures, we will talk about the structure of pollen grains, but as of now, let's just understand that a pollen grain is nothing but a male gamete which is developed inside the pollen sac. Now what we can see is this is our filament. Okay, and right at the center, this filament, okay, right at the center we have got the connective tissues. Okay, so as of now, this particular part of the male gametes, that is the androecium structure, might be just enough for us, but in the future lectures we would discuss more in detail about it. Now moving on, we have the corolla. The corolla, also known as the petal as an individual unit, we can see that this is the most colorful part and the most beautiful part of a flower. So in general they are of different colors. Okay, they are of different colors, or sometimes they are white in color. Okay, have you ever wondered like why the corolla or the petals are in such different colors, or why are they colorful, or why are they white? What advantage can it have? Or if we also imagine the corolla, some of the petals are very broad, okay, and some of the petals are very small. Sometimes they just drop off. Now what advantage can it have if it is of different color, or if it is white in color, if it is broad, or if it is not prominent? Now what we understand is, what is the reason behind being colorful? The reason is very simple. it will try to attract the insects for pollination. Okay, so pollination is nothing but the transfer of pollen grains. Okay, so if the petals are broad, then it is easier for the flower to attract the insects from a very large distance. And imagine if a insect is there which is more active at the daytime. Okay, if it is more active at the daytime, then at daytime the colors like red, pink, blue, their visibilities are much better. So it would be easier for the flowers which are red, blue or pink colored to attract the insects which are more active at the daytime. But the insects which are at the night time, which are more active at the night time, they would have very poor visibility. This kind of flowers that is in red or in your pink or blue, they would have very poor visibility at night. So that means the insects like the moths which are more active at the night time, they would find it more difficult to identify the flowers. But the flowers which are white in color or which have got white petals, their visibilities are much better at night time. So that means the insects like moths which are more active at the night time, they would find it easier to attract. But this kind of white flowers, their visibilities are poor in daytime. So that means this kind of flowers which are white in color, they will not try to attract the insects which are more active at the daytime. Rather, they will try to attract the insects at the night time because of their better visibility. Okay, and what we see is the flowers which has got very small petals. It means they are not trying to attract the insects. So if they are not trying to attract the insects, okay, if they are not trying to attract the insects, then how would they perform the task of pollination? To whom would they rely for pollination? In that case, they would rely on some other agents like the water, the wind for their pollination. Now the outermost world. The outermost world is known as the calyx. Individual unit would be known as the sepal. So what we see is that this is our sepal. Okay, since they are generally green in color, so they would be able to perform the task of photosynthesis. Okay, sometimes they are colorful. So if they are colorful, that means they should be able to attract insects for pollination. And what we can also see is in a young bud, in a young floral bud, what we can see is that it completely covers all the floral parts. So that means we can say that the sepal, it is also responsible for protection when the flower is very young. So protection of young floral buds. Okay, so that's all we can talk about a typical flower, and regarding the other floral parts we can look into the other lecture videos. So thank you.